watching Shalom TV, celebrating Jewish culture. Funding for Shalom TV has been provided by the following. And by viewers like you.
I'm Mark Golub, and a few weeks ago, I see the cover of Time magazine. It has a Jewish star on the cover, which draws my eye to it. The star is made of flowers. Nice. And then I read the title of the Time magazine piece, which is Time magazine's cover story for its September 13th edition. And lo and behold, the title is Why Israel Doesn't Care About Peace, written by Karl Vick. And I'm dumbstruck. Time magazine is suggesting that Israel doesn't care about peace? What can they possibly be thinking? What can they possibly mean? Prime Minister Netanyahu has been pushing for direct talks with Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinians for months and months, and has declared his Likud government is prepared to work out a two-state solution. As this edition of Time magazine hits the newsstands, Netanyahu and Abbas have just met in Washington under U.S. auspices to begin working on a peace agreement and agreed to continue the process beyond Washington. And Time magazine runs a cover story saying that Israel doesn't care about peace. And I'm sure many of you saw the same edition of Time, and I'm sure many of you were taken aback by the cover as I was. More, I'm sure many of you were offended by the cover. It's an offensive title. Offensive to the state of Israel, to the people of Israel. And in some way, I feel it is offensive to the Jewish people as a whole. It's as if Time magazine is really saying, Jews don't care about peace. Now, I know there are those of you watching right now who agree with me, but would also say to me, Mark, why are you surprised? Why would we expect any better of Time magazine? And what's interesting, if one gets beyond the cover and actually reads Karl Vick's piece, it's not a bad piece at all. It describes Israeli life as thriving, stable, relatively free of Palestinian terrorism. In fact, it mentions that since Israel put up the protective fence on its border with the West Bank, there has not been one terrorist incident inside Israel. And it goes on to say that Israelis do not experience conflict with the Palestinians the way it is portrayed in the American media. And if any of you have recently visited Israel or visited Israel in the last 10 years, you know that this has always been the case. It's always been the Israeli mentality to live life as fully and as normally as can possibly be. To be concerned with matters of life, not war, matters of daily life. Going to school, making a living, finding a place to live, deciding where to go on vacation, enjoying the benefits of a thriving Israeli economy and society, while also addressing the serious social issues which, at the moment, Israel must address, such as the quality of Israeli education, the absorption of new immigrants, and finding ways to assist those who are financially struggling in Israel today. War and peace are not the issues which dominate the streets of Jerusalem or Tel Aviv or Ashdod, the community Karl Vick decides to focus on in his Time magazine piece. But that doesn't mean Israel, as a nation or as a nation politic, doesn't care about peace. Peace is what Israelis have craved since the day David Ben-Gurion read the Declaration of Independence of the modern state of Israel in May of 1948. It's why Yitzhak Rabin pushed for Oslo and shook Yasser Arafat's hand on the White House lawn. It's why Ehud Barak offered Yasser Arafat a complete Palestinian state at Camp David in the year 2000. Israelis have cared and continue to care about making peace with the Palestinians and the entire Arab world. And if you get beyond the outrageous title on Time magazine's cover, and you actually read the Time magazine piece, you see that Vick ultimately documents the very opposite of what the Time cover suggests. In his last paragraph, Vick quotes an Israeli who says, "I'm on vacation. Part of my vacation is not to listen to the news every half hour." But Vick writes, she knows that the news matters. And so Vick also writes, Israelis are, quote, paying close attention and insist that anyone who claims otherwise is telling a tale. Or as another Israeli puts it, you have a son in the army, and your sister's son is in the army, you're involved. Are Israelis ignoring the peace talks? As Vick quotes yet another Israeli, it's impossible. You can't do it. So lo and behold, Vick's actual article describes the good life in Israel, how Israelis go out of their way to live a normal life. But they're all aware of and hopeful of a peace settlement being worked out with the Palestinians and the Arab world. Most Israelis are skeptical, as I'm sure many of you are. But they're hopeful. And Israelis certainly care about peace. And the question, therefore, is, why did Time magazine choose to run a title on their cover that so distorts the truth of Israeli life and Israeli sentiment? I am joined now on our phones from Boston by a media analyst for CAMERA, the Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting in America, Dexter Van Zile, and it was his organization which did a major campaign in the Jewish community in response to the Time magazine piece. And Dexter Van Zile, thank you so much for giving us a moment of your time.
Thanks for having me.
Dexter, what do you think was behind the Time magazine the Time magazine's cover title suggesting that Israel doesn't care about peace?
I think we're talking about a magazine that's on the ropes as far as circulation is concerned. You know, in 2009, the magazine had a circulation of about 3.4 million subscribers, but these days it has about 3.25 million. So in the course of about 1 year, it's lost approximately probably about 200,000 subscribers. And it's also experienced a 35% decline in newsstand sales during the last half of 2009. Those were the statistics I could find. And so if you're editor of a magazine that's suffering from a substantial decline in newsstand sales, you need to have something that will grab you. And you need something that's going to grab the eyes of the reader and somehow bring them in. And ultimately what happened was that the editor, Rick Stengel, he said it quite clearly when he appeared on CNN after the magazine hit the stands. He says, we were looking for a conceptual scoop. And what they were trying to do was to basically get people to buy the magazine because it fed into notions of Israel as being, indifferent to, its own safety, its own future, and also of the plight of the Palestinians. That's exactly what they were trying to do. They were trying to portray Israel as, kind of a monstrous nation, and they thought that would sell a few more magazines off of the newsstand.
Dexter, do you agree with me that the actual piece itself is less damning than the title?
Well, the impression I got was that it was an attempt to somehow put the onus for making concessions on Israel and set the stage for blaming Israel if negotiations fail. And I think that you're right that the text of the article was good, or let's say that it wasn't as bad as the cover and of the title. But when you look at the pictures that are associated with the print version of this article, you've got a picture of a young Israeli man relaxing on the beach with a tattoo of a Star of David on his shoulder, and then you've got pictures of other people, sitting in a park or on the beach or at a cafe. The impression is that and this is kind of subjective, but I thought that they were trying to portray the Israelis as if they were like citizens of ancient Rome prior to its collapse. They're depicted as oblivious to the threats they face and indifferent to the opportunities for peace that exist. And one of the things that that Karl Vick took great pains to suggest is that now that the Palestinians are serious about peace and about self-governance, that somehow that hope that maybe the Israelis are going to blow this opportunity. As someone who's been to Israel twice and has spoken to Israeli soldiers and victims of terrorism, I was really offended. I'm a non-Jew, okay? I'm a Roman Catholic, and in 2007, I spoke with a woman who delivered food to her neighbors while Hezbollah was launching rockets into northern Israel during the summer of 2006. And she knew full well what the consequences were of, ongoing violence or war between Israel and its neighbors. And when I look at the magazine article in total, I think that it essentially gave a kick in the teeth to Israelis who've decided to live happy, productive lives, despite living under the threat of terror. Israeli Jews have decided not to give groups like Hamas and Hezbollah or Iran the ability to exercise a veto over Jewish national life. And clearly the cover of that magazine defamed those people. And I find that frankly disgusting. And when you look at the numbers, its competitor Newsweek was recently sold reportedly for $1, which gives you a good idea of what people think weekly news magazines are worth. And in the past 4 years, it's had to lay off approximately 25% of its staff. Clearly, you're talking about a magazine that's having a tough time, and they said, "Well, let's see if we can get away with, something a little edgy, and see what happens, and see maybe, And I know that this makes me probably sound a little suspicious or paranoid, but this is the type of controversy that will drive, people will buy the next issue to see how people respond to it. People will go. It'll generate web traffic." This is one of the things that we've started to wonder about is, are people engaging in some sort of, anti-Israelism that kind of borders into anti-Semitism just to see whether or not they can actually generate web traffic. And that's very troublesome.
Dexter, you're suggesting in a way that Time magazine hoped to increase its circulation by making Jews angry.
Yeah.
If Time magazine has watched any of the polls of American sentiment, the American people remained overwhelmingly pro-Israel. The Congress is overwhelmingly pro-Israel. Some have argued that there's been a new shift in the Obama administration back to a more traditional U.S.-Israeli relationship. It seems like it would be counterproductive for Time magazine to try to boost its circulation by attacking Israel as opposed to saying something about Israel's emerging here as a powerful force for peace.
See, I think this is one of the things that is a great paradox. And I have kind of come to this conclusion by way of my work at camera because I deal primarily with mainline Protestant churches. In the past few years, these churches basically attacked Israel in a way that was just very remarkable because,
yes.
At the height of the Second Intifada, these churches came out and issued resolutions and, produced materials that blamed Israel for the violence directed at it during the Second Intifada, which was contrary to what the vast majority of the American people understood. They understood that Israel withdrew from territory in 2005 from the Gaza Strip. They understood that Israel had made a legitimate offer at Camp David. Arafat said no. The violence erupted. the Israelis accepted the Clinton parameters, and the violence got. But Arafat again said no, and the violence got worse. So the American people understood it, but I get the sense that there are some institutions in the United States that seem to think that it's going to be in their interest to either attack Israel or, into another extent, also embrace a certain anti-Americanism because it generates buzz. And if you look at a lot of the movies that have come out of Hollywood over the past several years, a lot of them basically kind of portray. Some of them portray Israel as kind of a force, the United States as a force for evil in the world. And there's people on Pajamas Media that have suggested that, which is an internet website that actually does some pretty good analysis. They've raised the question, are people engaging in anti-Americanism to appeal to a global audience? And I'm wondering if the same thing isn't taking place. I don't know, but the internet, typically would give people access to a global audience. So, maybe there's an attempt to hopefully generate web traffic from people overseas.
Very interesting.
And I don't have a crystal ball, and I don't know, but the thing is that I have seen the churches clearly, the mainline liberal Protestant churches clearly attacked Israel in an attempt to generate controversy and to portray themselves as being somehow relevant. And the fact that it insulted most of the American people just didn't seem to register.
Interesting. Dexter, you heard me say that in some way I feel the title is not only offensive to the people of Israel, it's offensive to the Jewish people. As one who is not Jewish yourself, Dexter, what was your reaction to my feeling?
I thought the first thing I thought of it harkened back to the January 14th, 2002 issue of the New Statesman, which is published in England. And there was a cover there that depicted the Star of David piercing the heart of the Union Jack. And the title of this on this magazine was Kosher Conspiracy. And it essentially depicted Israel as and its supporters as a disloyal group of people in Great Britain that needed to be expelled from the English body politic. That's Bernard Harrison, who wrote, the text, who's written a book called The Resurgence of Anti-Semitism. I clearly think that this was absolutely, was this an insult against the Jewish people, Time magazine's cover? Yeah. Because there's been an ongoing effort to basically portray Israel and its supporters, the vast majority of whom, or a lot of whom, happen to be Jewish, as somehow worthy of contempt. And how could you, in good conscience, support the continued existence of the Jewish state if its people were so decadent and so indifferent to the very crucial questions facing them as a people?
Dexter, there is a real concern in the Jewish world that there is a concerted effort now to delegitimize the state of Israel, and that the Time magazine cover, again, to me it's more the cover than the article, although I think you do describe the piece accurately, but that the cover is in some way a weapon to delegitimize Israel. Do you see any truth to that?
Well, I think that what they did was that they picked up imagery that have been out there for years. During the recent conflict in 2006, when Israel was fighting Hamas and Hezbollah, and then again between 2008 and 2009 at the tail end, when it was fighting Hamas in the Gaza Strip, we saw protesters carrying signs that equated the Star of David with a swastika.
Yes.
And so what has happened is and people know that that's anti-Semitism. They understand that completely. And what I have started to think is that essentially this assault on Israel's legitimacy is ultimately an attack on the Jewish people writ large. Because what happens is that when people defame Israel and they portray it as a unique source of suffering in the Middle East and the exclusive source of suffering, essentially who but a monstrous people could defend such a monstrous nation as it is described by its enemies? Mm-hmm. And if you look at the level of violence and hostility towards Jews in Europe, Great Britain, we are starting to see, violence or hostility. Jews have left Malmo, Sweden, in droves, largely because of the anti-Israelism that's taking place in Sweden. And they understand, that what happens is that if you were a Jew, Jews in France do not typically wear their kippas in public anymore. They wear baseball caps over them. That's what their rabbis warn them to do. We all know about the death of Ilan Halimi in 2005. He was a 23-year-old French Jew who was kidnapped, tortured for 3 weeks, stabbed, and left to die at a train station on the outskirts of Paris by Muslims who had anti-Israel literature in their apartments. And his torture took place in the basement of a public housing project. People knew what was going on, and no one called the police. Then there was Pamela Wachter, who was an employee of the Jewish Federation in Seattle. She was shot to death at the height of the Hezbollah war by a man describing himself as a Muslim American angry at Israel. And as it turned out, he was later to be discovered to be suffering from mental illness. But he was encouraged largely by the highly charged anti-Israel and anti-Jewish atmosphere that I think is erupting about over Israel. We've seen some of the most vicious anti-Semitic imagery at anti-Israel rallies in the past few years, and the mainstream media does not even mention it. Mm-hmm. And, there was a recent admission of a young Muslim woman at the University of California in San Diego who said that she supported the genocide against Jews in Israel. And then, after that, there was a recent stoning of a dance troupe of Jews in Hanover, Germany. And so when you look at all of this violence and all of this hostility, you have to say, where does it come from? And people used to basically stand firm against anti-Semitism. This is the thing that I find most frightening, is that, when Nazis showed up and tried to rally in Skokie, Illinois, eventually they ended up protesting in Chicago. People were disgusted, okay? People were disgusted when neo-Nazis and the, people from the Christian identity movement come forward to condemn Jews or basically talk about, use, hostile or genocidal rhetoric towards them. But, at one point, Tom Trento, I don't know if you've seen the video, but there was a woman screaming, saying, nuke, nuke Israel, and calling for Jews to go back to the ovens. And also there have been people that have condemned, that have said that, Hitler was a good man and didn't finish the job. We saw this at anti-Israel rallies. But largely that's all been ignored.
Mm-hmm. Dexter, let me ask you two quick questions.
Okay.
One, have you seen any other major media organ do this kind of story, again, in essence, delegitimizing Israel? In America, I'm talking about.
Not yet. Maybe I'm missing something. But, what I would do is I would just have people go look at Camera's website and just see the huge volume. There are people that get it wrong because they get, they're ignorant and they don't understand the details of the Arab-Israeli conflict. And the thing is that it's, what this did was that this was kind of more of like a rogue wave, okay? But the sea's getting, frankly, I think it's getting worse overall. It's getting choppier, and I think that this is one of the things that but I have to make clear, it's not as bad here in the United States as it is, say, in Europe or Great Britain.
Yes.
And one of the heartening things about this was that people were just outraged.
Yes, yes.
People were outraged, and so that indicates to me that there is still life left in our civil society here.
Very, very good. One more question for you. Does Time magazine owe Israel and American Jewry an apology?
Yeah, I think so. I think this is, and look, the New Statesman eventually published an apology for its use of the Star of David piercing the heart of the Union Jack. I think what will happen is that at a certain point, people at Time are going to realize, we crossed the line, we were trying to be edgy, and we got it wrong. And I hope that's what happens. And I think that eventually it is going to happen.
Dexter, I have to stop you only because we're out of time. You are wonderful to talk with. I hope you'll let me call you on other occasions.
Absolutely.
Dexter, thank you and be well.
All right. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
And those were the thoughts of Dexter Van Zile, media analyst for CAMERA, the Committee for Accuracy in Least Reporting in America. I have on our phones now a very wonderful guest for you to hear. It's the author of the Time magazine piece, Karl Vick, who we're talking to from Jerusalem. Karl, thank you for giving me a moment of your time.
Hey, it's my pleasure.
Karl, I already said to our audience that I was deeply offended by the title of the Time magazine article because it made it sound like the piece was saying that the people of Israel, the state of Israel, and maybe even the Jewish people as a whole don't care about peace. I then said that if you opened up the piece and actually read Karl Vick's story, it had a very different cast to it. It seemed to me that you were saying there are many Israelis who are enjoying all the benefits of Israeli society as it exists today, but that the end of your piece quoted a number of Israelis who said that it was impossible not to care about or be involved with watching and hoping that the current peace process in fact yielded results. Did I misstate what you tried to do at the end of your piece? I want to give you a chance to clarify what you were trying to do with the article. And let me say one last thing and then I'll listen to you. Very often titles are created by other than the author. Titles are often given by magazine editors, and there are people hired to do nothing but create titles. Was the title, Why Israel Doesn't Care About Peace, your title, or was it a title given to your piece?
Oh, no, it was not my title. I mean, I come out of newspapers. I was for years with the Washington Post, and you're always telling people, you know, the reporters don't write the headlines.
Right.
And magazines, it's a totally, it's not totally, but it's even more so. I would underscore even more so. I mean, the people who put together the covers are trying to probably be as provocative as they can.
Okay, Karl, does the title suggest what your article tried to describe to the American reader?
Well, I mean, I don't want to. My bosses wrote the title, so I'm going to refrain from too much of a critique. But talking about the article, I mean, I think your reading of it is correct, and what I get to at the end when I have these Israelis talking about how nobody can ignore the peace talks, nobody can ignore the conflict. You know, I think that's a home truth. You know, I think that's coming back to the foundation truth here, which is that, you know, it's always the most important. Peace is always the most important issue here. But at this moment, as new talks begin, Israelis are not in the mood. They've had not only, you know, whatever it is, 17 agreements without an actual peace that's following, you know, all of these false starts and empty, you know, unfulfilled hopes since Oslo at least. And, you know, and we're still here in Israel, and it's basically the aftermath of the Second Intifada, which was a great national trauma here. Mm-hmm. You know, beyond what it was on the Palestinian side, but this story was really focused entirely on Israeli society. Yes. So it was really about how, you know, when Obama's announced these new talks, not when he had started the summit and had Netanyahu and Abbas and the rest in Washington, but when they announced the talks, it wasn't on the front page of the two largest newspapers.
Karl, are you suggesting you are critical of Israelis for that?
No, I'm not. I mean, again, the headline said, you know, is this wise, is this not? I'm just saying this is, I moved here and fairly recently and went, boy, this is really quite a lovely country they've got here. I mean, it's a Mediterranean lifestyle. It's a great climate. People are doing well generally. The rich are doing really well. And you can enjoy life, and people seem to be enjoying life.
Mm-hmm.
They've basically turned inward because that's where the rewards are. Turning outward toward they would say toward the Palestinians, who are not capable partners, willing partners at the top, and just getting their hopes up is not rewarding. So they behave as people will.
Now, you made a very good point. It's not my place. It would be inappropriate of me to pit you against Time editors that wrote the piece. So I want to try to ask you the question in a generic way.
Yeah.
You're living in Israel now. There are those who are very concerned, especially throughout Europe. There's an attempt to delegitimize Israel. And that what we don't want to see is American journalism in any way get sucked into that process. In general, do you feel that that is a fair American Jewish concern and a fair Israeli concern?
It is. Of course it is. But I would also observe that and certainly that as a provocative cover line is worth debating, and people have reactions and are entitled to all the reactions, of course, and all the sensitivities are worth having. But most of the criticism has come, I've noticed, from outside of Israel. Israelis, part of it is the magazine's kind of hard to get here for some reason, but when they read this, when Israelis read this, I see on the message boards on Haaretz and English language editions of Israeli newspapers, people defending as you had, the sort of like the substance of it.
Yes.
And yet the ADL and others are having this. I don't want to characterize it as knee-jerk, but it does seem to be reflexive and very. I mean, it's.
Karl, the title is offensive. I say again, your article, what I hope is people get past the cover, because your piece is well written and I think it's very fair. But the cover is outrageous.
Yeah. I guess the natural thing is to go to what is seen as the problem.
Yes.
And emphasize that. And sensitivities are what they are. So that all is worth paying attention to.
Well, I'll say this again. You are so kind and classy to come on and talk with me here on Shalom TV. And I applaud you for the content of the piece. I'm sorry that in some way the cover has kind of smeared you. I hope we have helped put this in proper perspective, not only in terms of Time magazine, but in terms of your journalistic integrity. I thank you, and maybe one day we'll get to sit together in person.
That'd be fun.
Thanks you, Karl.
A lot.
I appreciate it very much. Be well.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And that was Karl Vick, who wrote the cover story of the September 13th Time magazine piece, which Time editors entitled, Why Israel Doesn't Care About Peace. As always, I'd love to hear your reactions to the things you've heard here, first from Dexter, Van Zile, and now from Karl Vick. Please email me or write me this week. Is this much to do about nothing? Did you see the piece? Were you outraged by the piece? In general, did you read the piece? And do you agree with me that the piece itself is much more balanced? As always, I look forward to hearing from many of you this week. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.